The morning after my wedding, I woke up to pain I couldn't name and shame I couldn't speak about. I lay there in the darkness, Jacob still asleep beside me, wondering if this was normal, if every wife woke up aching in places she didn't know existed. The sharp discomfort was something I just had to accept as part of marriage. Nobody had told me anything. Not my mother, not the older women at the quilting bees, not the church. 3 weeks of mornings became 3 weeks of silent suffering. I'd wake before dawn, move through the farmhouse like a ghost, feed the chickens, milk the cows, prepare breakfast with my jaw clenched so tight I thought my teeth might break. Jacob would eat without looking at me. He didn't know. How could he know when I said nothing? When the theology of my community taught me that a good wife endures without complaint, that my comfort was secondary to my duty, that speaking about such intimate matters was immodest and proud. So I told myself this was what marriage meant. This was faithfulness. This was obedience. This was my cross to bear. But it was the fourth Tuesday when my neighbor Miriam appeared at my fence, silent and quick, pressing a small glass jar into my hands, before disappearing back toward her house, without a word. The jar was unlabeled, filled with something golden that caught the sunlight. I stood frozen, completely bewildered, until 3 days later, when desperation drove me to open that cupboard in my kitchen where Miriam worked, where I'd seen her pour it over vegetables 100 times. Olive oil. It was olive oil. And when I understood, when I finally comprehended what she was telling me without words, I sat down on the kitchen floor and wept. Not from relief alone, but from the crushing weight of understanding that the answer had been there all along, in my own home, in a substance so ordinary and so forbidden that no one would ever speak its true purpose aloud. My name is Esther, and I grew up Old Order Amish in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. And this is the story that my community would prefer I never tell. I left 3 years ago, and on this channel, Esther's Truth, I share the things that were kept hidden, the knowledge that was stolen from us through silence, and the cost of a system that calls suffering holy. The pain I experienced during those first weeks of my marriage, the burning, the bleeding, the shame of not knowing what was wrong with me, was not a mystery, and it was not an accident. It was the direct result of a theology that sees women as vessels of obedience rather than human beings, with bodies that deserve care and information. The Amish faith teaches 3 fundamental pillars in marriage, and none of them protect a woman's well-being. The first is submission without question. A wife's body is not her own. It belongs to her husband and to the will of God as the church interprets it. Her pain is irrelevant. Her comfort is weakness. Her pleasure is never mentioned because it doesn't factor into the equation. The second pillar is suffering as righteousness. In my community, we were taught that physical pain, hardship, and endurance were signs of faithfulness to God. If something hurt, the solution was never to fix it. It was to bear it. To seek relief was to seek comfort, and comfort was luxury. And luxury was pride, the greatest sin of all. To speak about needing comfort was to admit you believed your body mattered more than your obedience. And that was unforgivable. The third pillar is absolute silence about the body. Before marriage, girls were told nothing specific, nothing practical, nothing real about what would happen on the wedding night. Any instruction, any honest conversation, any acknowledgement that the body would be involved in intimate acts was considered immodest. A mother could not speak to her daughter about this. A midwife was never called to prepare a bride. The church certainly said nothing. The Ordnung, the unwritten law that governed every moment of our lives, addressed theft and lying and pride, but it created a complete void around the subject. And in that void, generations of women suffered silently, believing their pain was normal, necessary, holy. I married Jacob on a cold Tuesday in October. The ceremony was held in my parents' barn. 4 hours of German hymns I'd sung my whole life, the bishop's long sermon about wifely submission, the declaration before God, and the community that I would obey. Jacob was 25, strong, capable of anything a farm required, and he was just as uninformed as I was. The information drought in Amish communities doesn't only silence women, it silences everyone. By the time Jacob and I were alone that night, I had been awake for 17 hours. My feet burned, my back ached, my head throbbed, and underneath every ache was a dread so heavy I could barely breathe. I didn't know what was coming. I knew something would happen. That much was clear from the careful way people had looked at me all day. The slight smiles, the knowing glances. But I had no idea what that something would be, and no framework for understanding it once it began. The pain came as a shock. It was sharp and wrong and nothing I could have imagined. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I wanted to push Jacob away, but I didn't. I wanted to tell him to stop, but I couldn't, because I had been raised to believe that my discomfort was not important, that my role was to accept, that resistance was a sin. I lay there in the darkness thinking about all the sermons about submission, thinking about my mother's closed expression when I asked her anything about marriage, thinking about the theology that had prepared me for obedience, but not for my own body. When Jacob finished and rolled over to sleep, I lay awake for hours, wondering if I was normal, if I was broken, if this was what the rest of my life would feel like. The next morning, I could barely walk. I moved through the kitchen like I was moving through water, everything between my legs aching, everything inside me feeling wrong and tender and used in ways I didn't understand. Jacob ate his breakfast and didn't ask if I was all right. I didn't tell him I wasn't. That was the pattern for 3 weeks. 3 weeks of pretending. 3 weeks of pain that grew sharper with each night. 3 weeks of lying to myself that this was marriage, that women accepted this, that to complain was to fail at the fundamental purpose of being a wife. I remember the night I nearly fainted in the kitchen. I was standing at the stove making supper, and suddenly the room tilted and my vision narrowed to a pinpoint. I grabbed the counter to keep myself upright and took deep breaths and told myself to stop being weak. I told myself that women had been doing this forever, that my body would adjust, that I just needed more faith, more submission, more willingness to accept what my husband needed. Then Miriam came to the fence. I was feeding the chickens, moving through the evening tasks like I moved through everything, mechanically, in pain, trying not to show it. Miriam was a neighbor I barely knew, a woman maybe 10 years older than me, with 3 children and a quiet way of moving through the world. She walked to the fence where I was standing, and without saying a word, she pressed that jar into my hands. Then she looked at me, really looked at me, seeing something that I hadn't said out loud, and she walked away. I stood there holding that jar, understanding nothing. I put it on a shelf in the kitchen, convinced Miriam had given me some kind of remedy for another problem, some herbal preparation or healing tincture. But 3 days later, when the pain had become almost unbearable, when I could barely sit down to milk the cow, when I was beginning to wonder if I should tell Jacob or if that would be shameful, I remembered the jar. I remembered the way Miriam had looked at me. I took the jar down and unscrewed the lid and smelled it. Olive oil, just olive oil. I held that jar for a very long time, my mind catching up to what my body had always known, that I was dry, that there was friction, that the answer was something so simple and so obvious and so completely forbidden to discuss that my neighbor had to pass it to me in silence, like it was contraband. I could have laughed. I could have cried. I did both. I wept because when I finally used it that night, the pain that had defined my existence for 3 weeks simply went away. The burning stopped. The tearing sensation disappeared. It was like my body had been speaking a language my mind wasn't allowed to understand, and suddenly someone had given me the dictionary. I wept because I understood that every morning I had already suffered, every night that had already happened, had been entirely unnecessary. The solution had been in my own kitchen the whole time, sitting on the shelf next to the flour and the salt. I wept because I understood that Miriam's silence, her refusal to speak the truth aloud, was not cruelty. It was protection. She couldn't say the words. If she had said, use olive oil for lubrication, if she had actually named what the problem was and what the solution was, she would have been violating the rules of modesty that governed her world. So she pressed a jar into my hands and walked away. And she risked something to give me that small act of mercy, because the system we lived in couldn't give it to me openly. I eventually told Jacob. It took me 2 weeks after using the olive oil to find the courage. We were sitting at the kitchen table on a Thursday evening, the lamp burning between us, and I said the words so quietly, he almost didn't hear me. I've been in pain. That's all I said. I'm not anymore, but I was. Jacob looked at me, and his face went through so many expressions. Confusion, then understanding, then something that might have been grief. He asked me why I hadn't told him, and I said the only thing I could say, because I didn't know I was allowed to. We sat in silence for a long time after that. The clock ticked on the wall. A horse shifted in the barn outside. The lamp threw shadows across his face. And in that silence, something between us changed. Not everything. We were still products of a system that had trained us both in the theology of male authority and female submission. But something shifted. Jacob began to see that my pain was real and my comfort mattered, and that love might mean more than just obedience. That conversation, the most honest moment in our entire marriage, happened because a woman I barely knew risked her own reputation to break a silence that should have been broken by my mother, by the church, by everyone who claimed to care about the health and happiness of my marriage. After I left, and I did eventually leave after years of struggling with faith and belief, and the weight of a system that had shaped everything about how I saw myself, the silence returned in a different form. My family's letters came back unopened. My mother's silence on the phone line when I called. The distance that appeared between me and everyone I had known. The shunning was the church's response to my heresy. The belief that a woman's body matters, that she deserves information, that her comfort is not less important than her obedience. I found an English therapist who asked me careful questions about my childhood, my marriage, my understanding of my own body. When I described those first weeks to her, when I used the language I'd learned in therapy to name what had happened, she looked at me with sadness and said, "That was completely preventable, just 3 words. Use lubricating oil." And I don't know why those 3 words broke something open in me. Relief, yes, because I finally had permission to believe that the pain wasn't my fault, that I hadn't failed as a wife, that my body's needs weren't shameful grief, because I understood all the suffering that could have been prevented. Not just my own, but Sarah's, who suffered for 2 years before someone finally whispered the answer to her, and Mary's, who believed for 5 years that pain was simply what marriage was, and Emma's, who was never told, who endured in silence for a decade before her own daughter finally passed her a jar over a fence, continuing the cycle of silent information sharing that should have been obvious and open all along. And underneath the relief and the grief was something my therapist would later help me name: rage. Cold, quiet, enormous rage at a system that had deliberately created a void of knowledge around women's bodies, that had called suffering holy and obedience virtuous, that had let generations of women believe their pain was normal and necessary and godly. My therapist said something to me in one of our sessions that I have thought about every single day since then. Control doesn't always look like a locked door or a harsh hand or an angry voice. Sometimes it looks like information that was deliberately kept from you. Sometimes control is the story you're told about why you don't deserve to know certain things. Sometimes it's the silence that fills the space where knowledge should be. The Amish world gave me things that I will carry always. A sense of community so deep it has texture, a capacity for hard work, a faith that is complicated and wounded, but real. But there is no theology that requires a woman to suffer in her own marriage bed. There's no scripture that says her pain consecrates her holiness. There is no God I believe in now who designed a woman's body, gave it nerves and sensation and the capacity for both pain and pleasure, and then intended for her to spend her first years of marriage too ashamed to acknowledge that body existed. The olive oil was always in the kitchen, and the fact that it had to come to me in silence, pressed into my hands by a neighbor at a fence, when it should have come from my mother's honest voice, from the church's pastoral care, from a community that claimed to love me. That is the whole story. Not the jar, not the oil, who gave it and who didn't, who spoke and who stayed silent, who valued my well-being enough to break the rules, and who kept the rules even as I suffered. If you grew up in a world where silence was called obedience, where your body was considered property, where your pain was reframed as virtue, I see you. Your comfort matters. Your body matters. Your knowledge of your own body matters. Your right to information and honesty and care matters. And if no one in your world ever said those words to you, I'm saying them now. I'm saying them loud enough to reach through the fence, loud enough to break the silence, loud enough to maybe reach another girl or woman who is lying in the darkness, wondering if her pain is normal, if she's broken, if this is just what marriage means. It's not. It doesn't have to be. Leave a comment. Tell me your story if you're ready. Tell me what surprised you. Tell me what you wish someone had told you. And if you want to keep hearing these truths from behind the line between two worlds, subscribe to Esther's Truth. I have so many more stories waiting. Stories about faith and control, about the price of silence, about the courage it takes to speak. Until next time, choose knowledge wisely. It might just save your life.